The wind, a merciless sculptor of the high plains, had been sharpening its edge against the widow's shack for 3 days straight. Ilara leaned against the doorframe, a shotgun slick with oil in her hands, her gaze fixed on the dust devils that danced like specters across the scorched earth. Her husband, Silas, was a memory as faded as the prairie grass. A grave marked by a crude wooden cross was all that remained of their life together. The last 6 months had been a bitter lesson in solitude, a grinding struggle to keep the small homestead from being reclaimed by the wild. She was a woman of the East, a transplant to this unforgiving land, and the raw grief that had once consumed her had been replaced by a hardened resolve. It was the 5th morning after the last dregs of dust had settled that she saw them, 2 figures on horseback, silhouetted against the rising sun, their forms blurring with the shimmering heat. Not a posse, their posture was too relaxed. Not settlers, their horses moved with a different, more fluid grace. They were Apache. Her hand tightened on the shotgun. The Apache from the Dragoon Mountains were a known presence, a force of nature as unpredictable as the weather itself. They rarely bothered the isolated homesteads, but rumor, a vicious and well-traveled thing, spoke of raids and retaliations. The men rode closer, their painted faces and feathered hair a stark contrast to the bleached landscape. One was older, his face etched with the lines of 100 suns, his movements economical and deliberate. The other was younger, his muscular frame radiating a tense energy. His eyes, dark and sharp, seemed to miss nothing. He carried a rifle across his lap, its barrel catching the light. Ilara stood her ground, the shotgun leveled but not aimed, a silent declaration of her readiness. The older man raised a hand, a gesture of peace. "White woman," he said in a guttural, accented English, his voice a low rumble. "We mean no harm. I am a widow. My name is Ilara," she responded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "State your business." "I am Chaitan. This is Nantan. We ride to the river, but a storm broke our path. We seek water, a place to rest our horses." His eyes, a deep, troubled brown, held hers with an intensity that disarmed her. "We will pay." Ilara's mind raced. To deny them would be to invite trouble. To allow them was a risk, but her instincts, honed by months of living on the edge, told her they were not a threat. Not yet. She lowered the shotgun slightly. "There's a well out back. The water is clean, the corral is empty. You can rest your horses there." They dismounted, their movements quiet and efficient. They were not what the townsfolk said they were, not the savage brutes of the stories. They were men, with the same weariness in their eyes she saw in her own reflection. Chaitan led their horses to the corral, while Nantan stood by the well, his gaze sweeping over the homestead with a quiet intensity. He was younger, and the fierce pride in his posture was palpable. He did not speak, but his presence was a powerful force. Over the next 2 days, they stayed. Ilara was surprised by the easy rhythm that developed between them. Chaitan, the older warrior, was a man of few words, but his quiet dignity was a comfort. He repaired a broken fence post without being asked, his hands moving with the grace of a man who understood the land. Nantan, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of motion. He practiced with his bow and arrows near the creek bed, the thwack of the arrows hitting their mark a constant rhythmic sound. He never spoke to her directly, but his dark eyes followed her every move. She found herself catching his gaze, a fleeting electric connection that left her breathless. He was afire, and she felt herself drawn to his heat. On the 3rd night, a cold front swept in, bringing a bone-chilling rain that drummed against the tin roof. The men huddled by the fireplace, the crackling flames casting long dancing shadows on the walls. Ilara sat on the other side of the room, a book in her hands she couldn't bring herself to read. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the unspoken tensions of their shared existence. Nantan finally broke the quiet. "You are not like the others," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. It was the first time he had spoken to her. "What others?" she asked, her heart pounding. "The white women. They look at us with fear, with hate." "I am not afraid," she lied, the words a thin veil over her own anxieties. "I am simply a woman trying to survive." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You are strong, like the mountain lion, alone but not broken." That night, something shifted. The barriers of race and culture, so rigid and unyielding, seemed to soften in the firelight. Ilara found herself talking about Silas, about their hopes, the life they had dreamed of that had been so cruelly cut short. Chaitan listened patiently, his face a mask of quiet empathy. Nantan watched her, his gaze unwavering. and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than fierce pride in his eyes. It was a shared pain, a deep understanding of loss. When morning came, the sun was a bright, clean promise, and the ground was no longer a parched wasteland. It was time for them to go. As they were saddling their horses, Chaitan approached her. "We will not forget your kindness, Ilara. The people will remember. There is a debt now. You are protected." He looked at Nantan, a silent, meaningful exchange passing between them. Nantan's eyes met hers one last time. He did not speak, but the intensity of his gaze was a language all its own. He rode away without a backward glance, but Ilara felt his presence long after he was gone. Chaitan lingered for a moment. "He carries a heavy burden, that one," he said, his voice low. "The weight of a promise he cannot keep. Be careful, Ilara. The path is not always straight." She was left alone again, but the solitude felt different now. The homestead was no longer just a place of grief. It was a place where she had connected with two men from a world she had been taught to fear. She had found a fragile peace, a moment of human connection that transcended the harsh realities of the Wild West. But in the quiet moments that followed, a new and unsettling emotion began to take root in her heart. Her fierce, wild energy that had been ignited by Nantan's gaze, and a quiet, profound respect for Chaitan. She had let two men from a warring tribe into her life, and now the lines between friend and enemy were no longer so clear. The ash of a broken promise, Silas's promise to protect her, had been scattered by the wind, and in its place a new and dangerous fire was beginning to burn. The quiet that followed their departure was a deceptive one. Ilara spent the next 2 weeks in a state of restless unease, her days a blur of familiar chores, and her nights plagued by dreams of two men she barely knew. One, a stoic protector, whose quiet strength promised a harbor from the storm. The other, a burning ember whose fierce, untamed nature called to a part of her she had thought long dead. The town of Redemption, a dusty, miserable collection of shacks a day's ride away, was a place she avoided. It was a wellspring of gossip and venom, where the memory of her husband's death was still a fresh wound, and her status as a young, childless widow made her an object of pity and suspicion. It was in the heart of this loneliness that a new, more immediate threat appeared. A group of 4 riders, not a posse but something more sinister, appeared on the horizon. They were drifters, men with hard faces and even harder eyes, their clothing worn and stained with the grime of 1,000 miles. They rode with the arrogance of men who took what they wanted. Ilara knew their kind. They were a different sort of predator than the Apaches. Their savagery was born not of a struggle for survival, but of a cruel, casual disregard for human life. They dismounted at her well, their leader, a man with a scarred face and a sneer that seemed permanently etched on his lips, tipping his hat with a mocking flourish. "Well now, what's a pretty thing like you doing all alone out here?" he drawled, his eyes raking over her with a vile possessiveness. Ilara stood her ground, her shotgun in her hands. "I'm not alone," she said, her voice a low, steady threat. "You've stumbled on a well-guarded homestead. Now get on your way." The man's sneer widened. "Well guarded by a woman, it seems. We're just passing through, ma'am. We'd appreciate a hot meal and a place to rest our heads." His men fanned out, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. A cold dread settled in her stomach. This was not a request. It was a prelude to violence. Just as the leader took a step forward, a sound cut through the tense air, a sharp, piercing whistle that seemed to come from all directions at once. The men looked around, startled, their bravado faltering. The whistle was followed by the low, haunting call of a coyote. One of the men, a younger one with a twitchy hand, grabbed his pistol. "That's a coyote call, you fool," the leader hissed. "There's nothing out there." But there was. From the jagged rocks of the canyon that bordered her land, a figure emerged. It was Nantan, his body painted with the colors of the earth and sky, a bow in his hand, an arrow notched and ready. Behind him, another figure, Chaitan, stood in the shadows, his face a mask of serene menace. They were not there by coincidence. They were watching. They had come back for her. "Leave the white woman be," Nantan's voice, a low and dangerous rumble, echoed from the canyon walls. "She is under our protection." The drifters froze. They had heard the whispers about the Apache, the fierce, unyielding warriors who were ghosts in the landscape. The scar-faced leader hesitated, his eyes flicking from the 2 warriors to Ilara. The glint of steel was gone from his gaze, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. He knew he was outnumbered and outmatched. "This ain't over," he snarled, a promise of a future reckoning. He and his men mounted their horses and rode off, their retreat a clear sign of their defeat. Nantan and Chaitan descended from the rocks, their movements silent and swift. Nantan approached her first, his dark eyes burning with a fierce intensity. "They would have taken everything," he said, the words a raw confession. "And then they would have killed you." "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The debt," Chaitan answered, his eyes on the receding figures of the drifters. "A promise made cannot be broken. We watched your homestead from the high passes. When we saw them, we knew." Ilara's heart was a confused mess of gratitude and something deeper. They had not come back to claim her. They had come back to protect her, and in that moment she saw them not as two men from a different world, but as her saviors. Nantan was a coiled spring of raw, untamed energy, his presence both terrifying and intoxicating. Chaitan was the calm eye of the storm, a quiet anchor in the chaotic world. They stayed again, their presence a silent, powerful reassurance. Nantan did not speak much, but he was always there, a shadow at her side, his gaze a constant, watchful presence. She found herself drawn to him in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. She would find him watching her as she mended a fence, or tending to the horses with a quiet concentration. His silence was not empty. It was a form of communication, a promise of a different kind of connection. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in streaks of fire and blood, Chaitan approached her. "He is torn," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Nantan. He has a duty to his people, a life already chosen for him, but he sees something in you. Something that pulls at his spirit." "And you?" she asked, her heart a drum against her ribs. "What do you see?" Chaitan looked at her, his eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. "I see a woman who has lost everything, a woman who is not afraid to stand her ground. I see a new path for my people, perhaps, one where we do not live in constant war." His words were a balm, a gentle counterpoint to Nantan's wild intensity. He saw her not as an object of desire, but as a potential bridge, a chance at peace. That night, as the stars began to pinprick the black velvet of the sky, Ilara sat by the fire, the two warriors on either side of her. The quiet of the plains was a living thing, a breathing presence. The world had shrunk to this small, fragile circle. She felt the weight of their attention, the pull of two different destinies. One, the fierce, wild call of a passionate young warrior. The other, the quiet, protective strength of a seasoned leader. She had sought solitude, but found herself in the middle of a conflict far greater than her own. Her love for two men from a tribe her own people called savages was not just a secret affair. It was a match to a powder keg. The fire in the canyon had saved her, but she was starting to realize it was also a fire that could consume them all. The war had not yet started, but the first whispers of conflict were already on the wind. The fragile peace of Ilara's homestead shattered with the arrival of a delegation from the Apache village. Not a war party, but a group of elders and warriors led by Chaitan and Nantan. They arrived not with war drums, but with a purpose that was both a promise and a threat. Chaitan spoke first, his face a mask of solemn authority. "The drifters you sent away, Ilara. They rode to the nearest settlement and spoke of a white woman who consorts with Apache devils. They say you are a traitor to your own kind. The word has reached the ears of our people, and it has reached the ears of your people." The air grew heavy with the weight of his words. The drifters, in their cowardice and malice, had lit a match. A posse, the kind that moved with the swift, vengeful certainty of a lynch mob, was on its way. This was no longer just about two men and a woman. It was about the collision of two worlds. The town of Redemption, a place built on the foundations of prejudice and fear, was preparing for war. Nantan, his youthful intensity simmering beneath a cool exterior, stepped forward. "They are coming. We can stay and fight, or we can take you to our village. You will be safe there. The mountains are our fortress. No white man would dare cross them." His eyes, a deep, fathomless black, held a burning plea. He was offering her a new life, a complete severance from her past. Ilara was a woman of the plains, a woman who had lived a life of quiet desperation. To run, to abandon her home, was to admit defeat. To stay was to face a bloody conflict. She had no hope of surviving. "I will not leave my home. This is all I have left." Her voice trembled, but her resolve was unyielding. "My husband's grave is here. I will not abandon him." Chaitan placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch a gentle reassurance. You do not fight for a home of wood and stone. You fight for a life. Silas is gone. A grave is a marker, not a prison. You must live, Ilara. His words struck a chord, a painful realization that she had been living in a mausoleum of her own making. Silas's memory was not a chain, but a ghost. And this ghost of vengeance, this posse from redemption, was not just coming for her. They were coming for the two men who had saved her, and by extension for the entire Apache tribe. As the sun began its descent, the distant thud of hooves became audible. The posse, led by a man named Sheriff Hollis, a cruel man with a reputation for brutality and a deep-seated hatred for all indigenous peoples. His posse was a band of vigilantes, men with no law but their own, their faces grim and set with a righteous fury. Chaitan gave a series of low, sharp whistles. The other Apache warriors, who had been hiding in the shadows of the homestead, emerged, their bodies painted for war, their weapons at the ready. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a siege. Chaitan took up a position on the roof of the shack, his rifle ready. Nantan stood by her side, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, his body a shield. "The white men do not understand our ways," Nantan said, his voice a low, steady thrum. "They see only what they fear." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not just a desire for her, but a desperate, passionate belief that she could be a part of his world. The posse arrived, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Sheriff Hollis rode to the front, his face a mask of grim determination. "Ilara, come out! We know you're in there with those devils. We can't guarantee your safety if you choose to side with them," he bellowed, his voice filled with a self-righteous rage. Ilara stepped out from behind the porch pillar, the shotgun held in her trembling hands. "They are not devils. They are the men who saved my life. They are not my enemies. You are." A roar went up from the posse. They had expected her to be a terrified victim, not a defiant adversary. The air crackled with tension. Chaitan fired a warning shot into the air from his vantage point, the sharp report echoing across the plains. "Turn back, Sheriff. The debt has been paid. The woman is under our protection. Leave this place now and you will not be harmed." Sheriff Hollis laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You think you can stop us? There are 10 of us, you red-skinned savages. You think your sorcery can save you?" "There is no sorcery, Sheriff," Chaitan replied, his voice calm and steady. "Only a promise and a debt. We have come to collect on that promise, and you will not stand in our way." The stalemate was broken by a shot from a member of the posse. It whizzed past Ilara's head, splintering the wooden porch post behind her. Nantan shoved her to the ground, his body a warm, protective weight over hers. The battle began. Shots rang out, the sound of the rifles a violent symphony against the dying light. The Apache warriors, silent and efficient, used the natural defenses of the homestead and the canyon to their advantage. They were masters of this land. The posse, used to fighting in the open, was at a disadvantage. Ilara watched, her heart a tangled mess of terror and awe. Nantan fought with a primal ferocity, his movements a blur of grace and violence. Chaitan, from his perch on the roof, was a deadly marksman, his shots finding their mark with an unnerving precision. In the chaos she saw them not as two separate men, but as two halves of a whole. Nantan was the fire, the untamed spirit of the wild. Chaitan was the earth, the foundation of a new world. And she, the White Widow, was caught in the middle of a conflict that was no longer just about love, but about survival, identity, and the very soul of the land itself. The ghost of vengeance had arrived, and it would not be appeased until blood was spilled. The fight was a brutal, chaotic dance under the dying sun. The posse, fueled by a self-righteous fury, pushed forward, but they were no match for the Apache's intimate knowledge of the land. Each rock, each patch of brush was a part of their defense. Ilara, crouched behind a water barrel, reloaded her shotgun with trembling hands, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She saw a man, one of Sheriff Hollis's deputies, fall to the ground with an Apache arrow in his shoulder. She saw another, a farmer from town, clutch his chest and fall backward. The Apache were not fighting for conquest, but for survival. Nantan, a blur of motion, moved with an almost supernatural speed, his knife flashing in the half-light. He was a force of nature, a terrifying and beautiful embodiment of the wild. Chaitan, ever the strategist, was a deadly presence on the rooftop, his rifle a final arbiter of life and death. He was the anchor, the reason they were holding their ground against a superior force. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a deep, bruised purple. The sounds of battle began to wane. The posse, their numbers dwindling, their confidence shattered, began to fall back. Hollis, his face a mask of rage and disbelief, screamed curses into the night. "You'll pay for this, you savages, every one of you will pay," he bellowed, before turning his horse and riding off into the darkness, his remaining men following close behind. The silence that followed their retreat was a deafening roar. Ilara emerged from her hiding place, her body aching, her hands and face smudged with dirt. The homestead was a scene of devastation. Broken glass, splintered wood, and the bodies of 3 men from Redemption lay still on the ground. She looked at Nantan, his chest heaving, a thin trickle of blood on his cheek. He had a deep gash on his arm, and she watched as his eyes, full of a fierce, untamed pride, met hers. He had risked his life for her. Then she looked at Chetan, who descended from the roof with the quiet grace of a phantom. He had a bandage wrapped around his leg, a bullet wound. He looked at her with an expression of profound sorrow. "The price of blood is high, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "They will be back, with more men. They will not rest until they have spilled our blood to avenge their own." His words hung in the air, a grim prophecy. She was no longer just a widow, she was a combatant, a woman who had chosen a side and in doing so had irrevocably altered the course of her life. She had aligned herself with 2 men from a warring tribe, and in doing so had become a target. The next few days were a blur of mending, of burying the dead, of preparing for the inevitable return of the posse. Ilara tended to Nantan's arm and Chetan's leg, her touch a hesitant yet caring one. In the quiet intimacy of their makeshift infirmary, the emotional currents between them grew stronger. Nantan's intensity was a palpable thing. He would watch her as she worked, his eyes filled with an unspoken adoration. He was a man of action, a warrior who expressed his feelings not in words, but in the fierce loyalty of his presence. One evening, as she was bandaging his arm, he reached out and gently touched her face. "Your hands are strong," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "They are not afraid of blood." Chetan, on the other hand, was a different kind of strength. He was a rock, an unwavering presence. He spoke to her of his people, of their traditions, of the long, painful history of their conflict with the white man. He did not ask for her love, but for her understanding. He offered her not just protection, but a new perspective, a different way of seeing the world. "Nantan is a young bull," he said to her one night as they sat by the fire, the younger warrior asleep in the corner. "He fights with his heart, but a war is not won by passion alone. It is won with a clear mind and a steady hand. He needs you, Ilara, but not in the way he thinks. He needs you to be his balance." Her heart was a battlefield of its own. She felt a fierce, wild attraction to Nantan, a man who had ignited a fire in her soul she never knew existed. She felt a deep, profound respect and an aching tenderness for Chetan, a man who offered her a quiet strength and a sense of belonging she had not felt since Silas's death. She was no longer a woman mourning a ghost. She was a woman in love with 2 living, breathing, complicated men. But the world outside their small homestead was closing in. An Apache scout returned with a grim report. The posse was regrouping. More men, more guns. This time they would not be caught by surprise. "They will bring the fire," the scout said, his voice a grim pronouncement. "They will burn this place to the ground." The time for waiting was over. She was at a crossroads. To stay was to face certain death. To flee was to abandon her home forever. But to which man would she entrust her life? The one who fought with a burning passion, or the one who fought with a quiet, strategic resolve? The price of blood had been paid, but the debt was far from settled. And in the heart of this storm, Ilara knew she had to make a choice that would not only decide her fate, but the fate of the 2 men she loved and the fragile truce that hung in the balance. The price of their survival was her decision, and it was a burden she alone had to carry. The air hung thick with the scent of fear and impending conflict. The posse was coming, this time with a grim determination that promised annihilation. They were no longer just seeking vengeance. They were coming to cleanse the land of a perceived blight, to rid themselves of the problem of the Apache and the woman who had allied herself with them. Ilara stood between the 2 men she loved, the quiet homestead a silent witness to a moment that would change everything. Nantan, his youthful face a mask of fierce resolve, held out his hand. "Come with me, Ilara. The mountains will be our sanctuary. We will build a life there. I will be your protector, your warrior. My people will be your people. This is our chance to start anew, away from the poison of their hate." His voice was a low, passionate plea, his hand a promise of a new, wild and untamed future. He was offering her a fire, a life of fierce passion and raw survival, a direct rejection of the world she had known. Chetan, his gaze filled with a quiet, profound sorrow, did not move. He looked at her not as a possession, but as an equal. "Nantan is a man of fire," he said, his voice a calm, steady counterpoint. "He will offer you a life of great passion, but also of great struggle. The path he offers is one of constant battle. My path is different. I am a leader of my people. I can offer you a home, a life where you are not just a woman with a man, but a bridge between two worlds, the white man's world and our world. We cannot win this war by running, Elara. We must find a way to make peace. And you are the only one who can help us do that. You are the only one who can make them listen. My heart is yours, if you will have it, not as a prize, but as a partner in a new dawn." The choice was not a simple one between two men. It was a choice between two futures. Nantan offered her an escape, a fiery, passionate love that would burn brightly, but might consume them both. Chetan offered her a purpose, a quiet, enduring love that could forge a new path for both peoples. Nantan was the fierce protector, the embodiment of a life lived on the razor's edge. Chetan was the wise leader, the embodiment of a life built on understanding and a desperate hope for peace. Elara looked at her home, the small wooden shack that had been a cage of grief for so long. She looked at her husband's grave, a silent reminder of a life that was meant to be. But that life was gone. The world she had known was gone, burned to ash by her decision to defy prejudice. She had been a widow. Now she was a survivor. She had chosen a side, and in doing so had found not just love but a new, deeper purpose. She took a step forward, her heart a drum against her ribs. She looked at Nantan, at the fire in his eyes, at the wild promise of his life, and her heart ached with a love that was fierce and raw. Then she looked at Chetan, at the steady, unwavering strength in his gaze, at the weight of a leader's burden he carried, and her soul found a deep, profound connection. Her hands, which had so recently held a shotgun, now reached out, and she placed one on Nantan's chest, her palm flat against his powerful heart. "Your fire will keep me warm, Nantan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But it would consume me, and I cannot allow that. My choice is not born of a lack of love for you, but of a knowledge of who I have become." She then turned to Chetan, her eyes filled with a new and resolute strength. She took his hand in hers, her fingers intertwining with his strong, calloused ones. "I have buried a life here," she said, her voice clear and steady, "and I refuse to bury another. This war cannot be won by fleeing, but by building a bridge. I choose the path of peace. I choose the new dawn." A flicker of raw pain crossed Nantan's face, but he nodded slowly, the fierce pride in his eyes dimming, replaced by a deep understanding. He was a warrior, and he knew a battle had been won, but it was not the one he had expected. He would not love her, but he would protect her, for she was a part of his world now. A new world. A rider appeared on the horizon, a scout from redemption. He saw the three of them, a white woman and two Apache warriors standing together. The message would be delivered. The widow had chosen. She had sided with the devils. The battle was coming, but now the terms of the battle had changed. It was no longer a fight over land or vengeance, but a fight for a new way of life. Elara had chosen a path, and it would be a difficult and treacherous one, but she would walk it with her head held high, a woman who had found her purpose in the most unlikely of circumstances, a woman who had started a war not with a gun, but with her heart.